Music Gun Gun is a 2009 Japanese arcade game that attempted to combine shooting and rhythm mechanics into a single experience. The idea never really took off, but it did raise an interesting question. Can these two gameplay styles actually coexist? Being one of the most niche combinations in gaming, rhythm FPS has only seen a handful of major attempts over the years. Metal Hellsinger, RoboBeat, Bullets Per Minute and Gun Jam each attempted a different take on the genre. Hellsinger follows a more linear, level-based format, RoboBeat and Bullets Per Minute are roguelikes, and Gun Jam is an arcade-style arena shooter. After playing all four, I came away with a clear-cut conclusion. Metal Hellsinger isn't just the best rhythm FPS, but it's the only one that truly understands what a rhythm FPS should be. And to explain why, we first need to answer a more fundamental question. What is a rhythm FPS actually trying to accomplish? At first glance, the idea sounds contradictory. On one side, you have shooters, which are all about improvisation, freedom of movement and split-second decision-making. On the other, rhythm games revolve around strict timing and adherence to a predetermined pattern. But despite their differences, both genres are ultimately testing the same skill: accuracy. Whether it's landing a perfectly placed headshot in CS or earning a flawless in Stepmania, success comes down to executing an action at precisely the right moment. The challenge of a rhythm FPS is finding a way to combine these two forms of precision into a single experience. All of the games I'll be looking at rely on a similar solution for communicating rhythm to the player. Visual indicators converge horizontally towards the center of the screen, lining up with the crosshair on every beat. By shooting when these indicators meet, the player stays in sync with the music. Since enemy tracking, navigating the environment, and reacting to threats all have to be taken into consideration, the first challenge here is to communicate timing without forcing the player to constantly stare at the center of the screen. This is where the rhythm FPS genre borrows from traditional rhythm games. Because the tempo stays consistent, players gradually internalize the timing and begin to act on instinct. Ideally, the indicators are there only to teach the rhythm or get the player back in sync with it, but they're not supposed to be necessary forever. Once the player gets into the groove of a track, the visual rhythm should disappear from conscious thought and be replaced by an internal one. At that point, maintaining the rhythm becomes half the challenge. The other half is everything you'd expect from a traditional shooter: aiming accurately, prioritizing targets, and positioning yourself. A rhythm FPS succeeds if these two challenges complement each other and don't feel like they're fighting for your attention. While Hellsinger, RoboBeat, and BPM all solve this particular challenge in a similar manner, Gun Jam takes a different approach. Instead of following a fixed tempo, the beats of a music track are variable and change as the song progresses. As a result, the player can no longer rely on internalizing a consistent tempo. This leads to having your attention constantly pulled back towards the rhythm indicators at the center of the screen. The best way I can describe it is trying to play a taiko rhythm game and an FPS at the same time. Yet, even among the games that get this fundamental aspect right, there are important subtleties that elevate Hellsinger above the rest. As I mentioned earlier, nearly every action in these games must be performed on the beat of the music, whether that be shooting, dashing, parrying, reloading, or executing an enemy. Generally, walking and jumping are the only unrestricted actions across all games, but there are some exceptions, and this is where the details matter. Both Hellsinger and RoboBeat allow for multiple actions to be performed on the same beat. So for example, the player can dash and shoot or parry and charge a weapon simultaneously. On paper, this opens the door for more player expression and creativity, but in practice, it creates a problematic trade-off. The more actions a player can perform on a single beat, the fewer decisions they need to make about which action deserves that beat in the first place. Most of the time, in order to maximize damage and movement, the optimal strategy is to always just spam as many actions as possible on each beat. Hellsinger keeps these tendencies somewhat in check, because the movement options are a bit more limited, only allowing you to dash and shoot or dash and reload on the same beat. but RoboBeat can turn into a chaotic mess fairly easily. It is by far the most movement-heavy game of the bunch, and also the one that allows for the most amount of actions per beat. A player can dash, jump, parry, charge weapons, shoot one of them, and use two different abilities within the same rhythmic window. I do wish the game was a little bit more restrictive in how many actions are allowed per beat. This amount of freedom makes the rhythm mechanic almost irrelevant. Thankfully, the game does use its music tracks in a creative way. A track's beats per minute directly affects enemy and player behavior. Faster songs allow you to dish out more damage in less time, but as a result, enemies are also more aggressive and attack quicker. The cassette system functions almost like a difficulty dial, with slower tracks producing a more manageable pace. It's the only game where the player can directly affect enemy behavior. Bullets per minute and gun jam take the opposite approach. Attempting to perform multiple actions on the same beat will cause one of them to be invalidated. This forces the player to make a conscious choice about how each beat is spent, as if it's a currency. The distinction may seem subtle, but it fundamentally changes how each game feels to play. In isolation, BPM and gun jam's approach seem to make more sense. If every beat is a limited resource, then forcing the player to choose between attacking, repositioning, or reloading creates meaningful decision making. Basically, every action carries an opportunity cost. Every beat spent on one task is a beat that can be spent on another. However, this logic only holds when rhythm is viewed as a constraint. Once we start looking at the experience of a rhythm FPS as a whole, a different picture begins to form. Metal Hellsinger uses the rhythm mechanic less as a resource that needs to be managed and more as a source of momentum. Staying on beat increases the score multiplier, which dynamically transforms the soundtrack. A higher score multiplier leads to higher damage and charging your weapon ultimate faster. More damage means faster hit streak build-up, which unlocks gameplay modifiers called boons. Every facet of the game is built around rhythm, and the game takes it even further. Buzz, a floating companion that acts as the game's narrator, is also an incredible addition to the gameplay itself. It's a single-shot, low-damage weapon that can be fired between encounters to preserve the combo multiplier. This may seem like a small detail, but it reveals a fundamental difference in design philosophy. While the other games are concerned with how the player performs while enemies are present, Hellsinger is the only one that's concerned with keeping the player engaged with the rhythm at all times. Of course, maintaining rhythm only works if the music gives the player a reason to stay in sync with it. While I do understand that music is highly dependent on personal taste, I'll still share a few thoughts on the soundtracks where relevant. What is far less objective, however, is how that music is implemented. The biggest difference between these four games is how the music itself is treated. Gun Jam takes an incredibly weird decision to allow auto beat matching by just holding the shoot button. This completely defeats the purpose of a rhythm shooter and just kinda turns it into a bad arena shooter with alright music. Initially, I thought I had enabled this option accidentally when going through the settings, but that's just how the game works, and you can't even turn it off. The only difference between holding the shoot button and matching the beat yourself is that the score multiplier can only be increased by manually matching the beat, except for when dealing damage to an enemy, as that will increase the multiplier regardless of how the beat is matched. As I mentioned earlier, since the rhythm is variable, the player has to focus their attention on the center of the screen most of the time. The issue is exacerbated by the fact that the beat types themselves are tied to their own weapons, so now the player has to pay attention not just to the irregular tempo, but also to which gun comes next. This takes all the attention away from the enemies, level geometry, and worst of all, the music itself. There's 10 songs in total, and while I find them more distinct than RoboBeat or BPMs, the track selection doesn't really have any sort of consistency to it. It sounds like someone just clicked on an obscure Spotify playlist and imported the songs into the game. RoboBeat offers a lot more quantity when it comes to the available tracks. There's almost 40 songs to choose from at the beginning of each run, most of them being different subgenres of EDM. I wouldn't really say the music in this game is something I listen to outside of playing the game, but it does a serviceable job at sustaining the rhythmic requirements for the gameplay. However, By far the biggest issue is that the game does exactly the opposite of Gun Jam. The game is so lenient with how much can be done on a single beat that the music feels like it's something you put in the background while playing the game. Being able to change the track at any point during a run and the BPM affecting enemy behavior are thoughtful additions, but not enough to bring the music itself back into the spotlight. Bullets per minute handles its music the worst out of the 4 games. Since music is tied to levels and this being a roguelike, it means that for most of the time you'll be listening to the exact same track. And when progressing through the levels, the order of the tracks is always going to be the same. The repetitive level structure causes tracks to overstay their welcome. Unfortunately, the songs themselves are not distinctive enough to listen to for as long as the game asks you to. Most of the tracks sound exactly the same, like generic main menu music. Thankfully, it is integrated into the gameplay much more thoughtfully than into RoboBeat or Gun Jam. Every action, except for walking and jumping, is tied to the beat. There's multiple reloading animations that each have different beat number requirements. Unfortunately, the Binding of Isaac level structure hurts the pacing a lot. There's often going to be times where you have to backtrack multiple rooms to grab an item or retrieve currency from the bank, leading to the downtime moments I alluded to earlier. During these sections, all of the rhythm mechanics feel like they just disappear. This is the place where Hellsinger is miles above the rest, both in the quality of the music and its implementation. The song's lyrics relate to the level they first appear in, giving each stage a distinct identity. The soundtrack changes dynamically based on the score multiplier, with vocals only kicking in at maximum level. Unlike RoboBeat, where the music mostly accompanies the player's actions, here the player actively unlocks the complete version of each song through their performance. Levels can be replayed using separate tracks for the enemy arena sections and the final boss of each level. Even the weapon's ultimate abilities are integrated into the rhythm design, such as the sword's ultimate ability changing the tempo of the music. But most importantly, every gameplay system works synergistically with the soundtrack. The music is both an incentive to play better and what enables better play. But that raises an important question. What does playing better actually look like? A rhythm game can reward timing, but a shooter also needs to reward creativity, decision making, and mastery of its mechanics. Satisfying weapons, interesting encounters, and mechanical depth is the second half of the equation that keeps the player engaged. Hellsinger's structure is very straightforward. There's a story cutscene at the beginning and end of each level, and everything in between is combat arenas with brief downtime sections. Every level ends in a boss fight that throws in occasional enemy waves while the boss is invulnerable. Unfortunately, this is the one area where not just Hellsinger, but every game in this video is lacking. Hellsinger uses the same boss across 7 different levels, with the only unique one being the final boss of the game. The different attack patterns and arenas do mix up the encounters enough to not feel repetitive, but I do wish there was more variety in boss encounter design. After completing a level, 3 challenge arenas called Torments are unlocked. These offer really fun twists on the gameplay, like randomized weapons after each kill or having to finish off enemies with a slaughter, which is this game's version of Doom's Glory Kill. Completing Torments unlocks Sigils, which are passive modifiers like faster hitstreak build-up, increased damage at lower health, and so on. These can be equipped 2 at a time before starting a stage. The player is incentivized to engage with these torments because the sigil effects often complement the gameplay in ways that range from useful to somewhat broken. There are 7 sigils in total, and by completing more difficult versions of torments, they'll be upgraded to higher tiers and improve their effects. In addition to Paz and Terminus, which are always equipped, the player can pick 2 more weapons before starting a level. While there's only 6 weapons in the base game, with 2 additional DLC ones, they all feel distinct from one another. It encourages the player to experiment with different combinations without feeling overwhelming. Each weapon's ultimate ability serves a different purpose, and the player is often incentivized to switch between weapons. For example, while the crossbow has powerful area of effect attacks, its ultimate ability is purely used for crowd control. Pairing it with a shotgun's ultimate results in a piercing blast that can clear an entire horde in one shot. The dual pistol's ultimate is useful for drawing enemy aggro, but it lacks damage output. The sight's ultimate has high damage and a wide area of effect, but it requires the player character to be right in the middle of an enemy wave for efficient damage. Every weapon fills a distinct role and there are no obvious redundancies. Most weapons are designed around single-shot firing, which prevents the rhythm mechanic from feeling restrictive. Equally important is the weapon sound design, which is integrated seamlessly into the rhythm mechanic. Every weapon delivers an exaggerated sense of impact, making even basic attacks feel powerful. All of it reinforces the game's fantasy of becoming stronger as the music intensifies. The Hound's ultimate fires on a tempo that matches the music. The Hellcrow's rate of fire is set up so that each sight returns to the player on every third beat. Even the slaughter animation is tied to the rhythm mechanic. Higher BPM tracks shorten slaughter animations, increasing the pace of executions and supporting more aggressive combat. Because slaughter can be initiated from medium to long range, it doubles as a repositioning tool, and the resulting hell drops reward offensive momentum and encourage risky comebacks. The enemy pool is wide and diverse enough to support a 5-hour playthrough. Each level introduces a new enemy type, so there's always a new pattern to learn. RoboBeat takes a completely different approach when it comes to progression. Unlike Hellsinger's linear campaign, it uses a roguelite structure with procedurally generated levels. New weapons, abilities, room types and music tracks are gradually unlocked across multiple runs, giving the player a steady stream of rewards and experimentation opportunities. In total, there's 24 weapons to unlock, 15 abilities and 38 music tracks. The problem lies in how the game structures its content. RoboBeat features 4 levels, but these aren't separate stages in the traditional sense. Instead, each new level incorporates all of the previous ones. Completing level 2 means replaying everything from level 1 before reaching the new area. Level 3 includes the content from levels 1 and 2 plus another new section, and level 4 repeats the process again. This structure might have worked if the game introduced new challenges along the way, but almost all of RoboBeat's enemy variety is front-loaded. While each new stage introduces a different boss encounter at the end, the regular combat remains largely unchanged throughout the entire campaign. As a result, later runs become increasingly lengthy while offering close to zero new encounters. The revisited enemies, bosses and environments stay the same, with the primary difference being numerical scaling to enemy health and damage. Instead of introducing new challenges, the game simply asks the player to endure the same ones, but for longer. It's a textbook case of artificial difficulty. This repetition is made even more noticeable by the game's soundtrack. While the tracklist is the largest out of these games, since individual runs can easily stretch beyond half an hour, listening to the same track for such an extended period starts to wear thin. Outside of acting as a difficulty dial, there is very little incentive to switch tracks mid-run. Doing so interrupts your focus, and because the game doesn't pause while browsing the music menu, it can actively hurt your performance. The problem is that unlike Hellsinger, the music itself never changes. There are no additional layers, no vocals gradually fading in, and no sense of escalation tied to player performance. Regardless of how skillful or sloppy your performance is, the track ends exactly the way it started. Without any dynamic response to what the player is doing, the music fades into the background and becomes nothing more than a metronome that occasionally dictates when you're allowed to act. RoboBeat's biggest strength is undeniably its movement system, which is very reminiscent of Ultra Kill and Titanfall. Wall running, grappling hooks, rail grinding, bunny hopping, slides, ground slams, dashes and double jumps give the player an absurd amount of mobility. Traversing arenas does feel fantastic, and chaining movement options together can be incredibly satisfying. The problem once again is that the movement system is so expansive that it often overshadows the rhythm mechanic itself. Where RoboBeat truly shines is its weapon variety. Between the game's large arsenal and extensive ability pool, there's no shortage of combinations to experiment with. More importantly, the weapons aren't simply differentiated by damage values or firing patterns. Instead, they gain additional properties when certain conditions are met. For example, successfully parrying an attack before firing might cause a projectile to change its pattern or even the attack type itself. Combining a charge with a parry can unlock an even stronger effect. This creates a satisfying layer of mechanical depth where the player is constantly looking for opportunities to enhance their attacks. The game also encourages weapon combinations. Since the player can carry 2 weapons at once, firearms with different firing rhythms can be woven together into a single sequence. A slow weapon such as a shotgun can be alternated with a faster one, allowing the player to fill otherwise empty beats and maintain a constant stream of attacks. In theory, this creates a more expressive combat system than anything found in Hellsinger. The problem is that RoboBeat's weapon design runs into the same issue as its movement system. The sheer number of interactions, abilities and weapon combinations often pull the player's focus away from the rhythm itself. Because the abilities and many of the movement options are not tied to the beat at all, instead of the rhythm serving as the foundation that everything is built upon, it becomes just another mechanic competing for the player's attention. The weapons are fun, the abilities are creative and the possibilities are impressive, but taken together, they often feel like a game that will have worked much better as a traditional movement shooter rather than a rhythm FPS. As it stands now, the game feels like it's being chained by the niche genre it tried to force itself in. Bullets per minute falls into a similar issue, but it has less to do with the overwhelming options and more so with the execution of the roguelike aspect. Before each run, you select one of the 10 available characters, or at least you will once those characters are unlocked. One is available by default, 3 are unlocked as you finish different areas, and another one once you finish the game on hard difficulty. The remaining 5 characters require more specific conditions, such as depositing 100 coins in the bank or killing 2000 enemies. Each character has access to a dash, a secondary ability, and an ultimate, or at least they will once you unlock them. To permanently gain access to them, the player must complete a run once on any difficulty for the secondary ability and once on hard for the ultimate, which raises the question, why would I play with that character again if I've already beaten the game on hard? The progression issues don't stop here. The game borrows from the Binding of Isaac, using procedurally generated rooms to make each run slightly different. Throughout a run, the player can upgrade their stats, find new weapons and abilities, keys that unlock chests, and coins that can be spent at altars and shops. Each of these systems has its own issues, which I'll go over briefly. Abilities almost never drop from chests, so until you clear a run with a character, you'll almost never see one. Stat boosts are so impactful to the game, to the point where you'll often restart a run just because you got something useless in the beginning. Most of the time you are either severely over or underpowered. Outside of the reloading animations, weapons don't feel distinct enough for how many there are, and the game makes the baffling decision to give the starting pistol the shortest effective range in the entire arsenal. I'm not talking about damage fall-off, but the bullet simply becoming ineffective once it crosses an invisible magical threshold. The keys, health potions and coins found in chests will often lead to excessive backtracking as well, whether because you found the chest without a key or discovered a potion while already at full health. Which brings us back to how the rhythm mechanic is integrated. During combat, I find BPM to be the most committed to its beat system. Unlike Hellsinger or RoboBeat, which allow for multiple actions on the same beat, BPM limits pretty much every action outside of walking and jumping to the rhythm. As I mentioned earlier, this should add a layer of decision making by forcing the player to choose which action deserves a beat, but in practice it almost never matters. The soundtrack is fast enough that you'll almost never have to make a trade between shooting and dashing. This results in the rhythm mechanic feeling like nothing but an artificially imposed limitation. This becomes worse during downtime sections, when the rhythm mechanic becomes completely irrelevant. I left the visual presentation for the end, but it's by far one of the game's worst aspects. Leaving the many reused assets aside, the best way I can describe the red visual filter is a bloodshot, nauseating AC trip. Paired with a high contrast that often causes enemies, projectiles and the environment to blend together, the game becomes exhausting to look at after a short while. The enemy roster is also severely lacking in complexity. There's plenty of enemies to shoot at, but they all feel identical gameplay-wise. While RoboBeat has much less enemy variety, they all feel distinct from one another. Gunjam is the only game in this lineup that completely misses the point of what a rhythm FPS is supposed to accomplish. While I can appreciate its attempt to move beyond the standard match a constant BPM to an action formula, the execution simply doesn't work. Not only does it fail as a rhythm FPS, but even as an arcade arena shooter it falls short in every aspect. The game features 3 playable characters, each equipped with a unique ultimate ability called an overdrive. One acts as a damage multiplier, another activates bullet time, and the third adds a melee attack to every projectile. Oddly enough, the characters are tied to specific arenas, rather than being freely selectable. This leaves the player with only 3 maps and very little room for experimentation. Each arena lasts for the duration of a single song, with the objective being to survive and score as many points as possible before the track ends. The weapon roster is equally limited. There are only 4 weapons in total: a grenade launcher, a shotgun, and 2 burst rifles that feel nearly identical in practice. The game tries to mask their sound design with its soundtrack, but if you lower the music volume, the weapons sound comically weak. Ironically, the game's only meaningful mechanic comes from its poorly designed rhythm system. The grenade launcher is so much more effective than the other weapons that it inadvertently creates the only interesting layer of decision making in the entire game. Maximizing damage means using weaker beats for movement and saving the high damage beats for explosive attacks. It's one of the few moments where the rhythm and combat actually complement one another. Unfortunately, it's nowhere near enough to carry the rest of the experience. I have to at least mention Gungem's development history, because it's the most bizarre thing I have seen. The reveal trailer, public demo, launch trailer, VR version and final release all seem like completely different games. Somewhere along development, the project went from a level-based shooter similar to Hellsinger to an arcade arena game, while the MetaQuest version became an entirely separate on-rails shooter. The easiest way I can describe a successful rhythm FPS is through a rock-paper-scissors comparison. Normally, each element exists in opposition to the others, but a rhythm FPS works best when the relationship is reversed. The music, rhythm and gunplay should never compete for the player's attention. If that happens, the game feels like you're playing an awkward mishmash of multiple genres instead of a cohesive experience. When all these elements work synergistically, that is, when the music elevates the gunplay, the rhythm empowers the player, and the gunplay gives physical expression to the music, then we can talk about a rhythm FPS. This is ultimately why the 4 games in this video arrive at such different results. RoboBeat is perhaps the clearest example of a kitchen sink approach to game design. It throws every movement mechanic under the sun, weapon synergies, abilities, music tracks, deck building elements that I haven't even gone into, and a roguelike progression system into one bulky package, wrapped with a last-minute rhythm system ribbon. While many of these individual systems are genuinely fun, the game will have benefited heavily from a more focused approach. Ditching the rhythm system entirely and embracing its identity as a movement shooter will have played far more to its strengths. Instead of reusing the same levels multiple times, the game will have benefited from a shorter, curated experience paired with a Hades-like difficulty system, allowing players to customize the challenge through optional modifiers. BPM suffers from a fundamentally flawed roguelike structure that rewards the player after they've already overcome the challenge it was meant to help with. Unlocking abilities feels like a delayed reward for content you've already mastered. Unfortunately, the game's other pillars aren't strong enough to compensate. As a shooter, the weapons lack distinct identities and the enemy roster feels identical. As a rhythm game, the beat mechanic is ever present during combat, but not meaningful enough to influence decision making beyond simply remembering to shoot on time. And outside of combat, it's completely irrelevant. And as a roguelike, the abundance of backtracking, inconsistent power scaling, and repetitive room layouts quickly wear down the sense of discovery that the genre relies on. It's a game that tries to combine 3 different genres, but doesn't succeed at any of them individually, let alone as a cohesive whole. And Gungeon seems to be an unfortunate case of a game lacking direction. Judging from its development history, the game had no idea where it was going, and just so happened to fall into a badly designed arena shooter with rhythm game elements. Not even the developers seem to know what happened, considering the only game featured on their website is their next dinosaur game. And that ultimately brings us back to Metal Hellsinger. Out of every game discussed here, it's the only one where the rhythm mechanic feels indispensable. The weapons, soundtrack, progression systems, enemy encounters, and score mechanics are all designed around the player acting in time with the music. If there is one question that determines whether a rhythm FPS succeeds, it's this: will the game be worse without the rhythm mechanic? Metal Hellsinger is the only game here where the answer is an unquestionable yes. It doesn't just use rhythm as a gimmick, but builds the entire experience around it. Even years after its release, it's still the only rhythm FPS that truly understands what a genre is supposed to be. Unfortunately, the studio behind the game closed in October 2025 following layoffs. It's unlikely that we'll ever see a sequel, but I do hope someone picks up the mantle and delivers a worthy successor.